Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. My name is Matthew, and I should have forgotten about Melissa 3 years ago. But some cases don't let you go. They dig their claws into your soul and drag you back to places that should remain forgotten. It was October 15th, 2019, when I found myself driving back to the Boundary Waters canoe area in northern Minnesota, my hands gripping the steering wheel of my Ford Ranger like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. The case file sat on my passenger seat, corners worn from too much handling. Melissa Catherine Rodriguez, age 23, disappeared September 13, 2016. Last known position GPS coordinates 47 degree 58 12 3 and 91 27 43.8 W. 3 fucking years. Every rational part of my brain screamed that she was dead. Had to be. Black bears, exposure, hypothermia, any number of natural explanations. I'd been a ranger for 15 years, seen enough bodies to know how the wilderness claims people. I feared nothing that walked, crawled, or flew in these woods, but something had been calling me back. It started with the dreams 2 weeks ago. Not nightmares exactly, more like memories that weren't mine. Flashes of a place deeper in the woods than I'd ever been, where the trees grew wrong and shadows fell upward. I'd wake up with a taste of copper in my mouth and coordinates burned into my retinas, the exact spot where we'd lost Melissa's trail. My radio crackled to life as I pulled into the ranger station. Unit 47, this is base. Matthew, what's your 20? Base, Unit 47 at Boundary Waters North Station. Beginning cold case review for Rodriguez Melissa. Grid reference Tango 7 Alpha. Static. Then, copy, Unit 47. Matthew? Nobody authorized a cold case review. And that grid reference? We marked that sector off limits after the Johnson incident. The Johnson incident? Right. Last year, veteran ranger Dave Johnson had gone in to check some unusual thermal readings in that same area. We'd found him 3 days later, catatonic, hair gone completely white overnight. He kept mumbling about the year that broke and drawing symbols that hurt to look at. Early retirement, they said. Stress. Base. I'm conducting an unofficial review. Family requested. Out. I switched off the radio before they could respond. The trail started normal enough. Melissa had been an experienced hiker, part of some university geology survey team studying the unusual magnetic anomalies in the area. Her teammates said she'd gotten excited about some rock formations about 6 miles in, formations that didn't match any known geological patterns. She'd gone ahead alone to document them. The first 5 miles I could have walked blindfolded. Standard northern Minnesota wilderness, red pine, white pine, the occasional birch stand. My boots crunched through 3-year-old leaf litter. My pack settled into the familiar rhythm of a long hike. Temperature holding steady at 47 degrees Celsius. Wind from the northwest at maybe 5 knots. Perfect tracking conditions. Then I reached the coordinates where we'd lost her trail. The wrongness hit me immediately. Not visually, but deeper, like stepping into a room where someone had just finished screaming. The hair on my arms stood up, and I could taste metal on the back of my tongue. My GPS started stuttering, the display flickering between coordinates that made no mathematical sense. That's when I saw the trees. They weren't dead exactly, but they grew in patterns that made my eyes water, branches twisted into geometries that shouldn't exist in 3-dimensional space. The bark had a texture like scarred flesh, and when the wind moved through them, they made sounds like whispered numbers. Jesus Christ, I breathed, pulling out my field notebook. But when I tried to sketch what I was seeing, my pencil wouldn't cooperate. Every line I drew seemed to curve away from where I intended, forming symbols that made my hand cramp just looking at them. I pushed deeper. The forest floor began to change. Leaves decayed in perfect spirals, and mushrooms grew in arrangements that resembled mathematical equations. My compass spun lazily, never quite pointing in the same direction twice. Time felt loose, thick. like walking through honey. That's when I found Melissa's backpack. It sat in a small clearing, completely undamaged despite 3 years of weather. The nylon looked factory fresh, the zippers working smoothly. Inside, everything was exactly as she'd left it. Water bottles still half full, trail mix in a sealed container. Her field notebook with the last entry dated September 13th, 2016, 3:47 p.m. But the final entry. Christ, the final entry. Found it. The source of the magnetic anomalies. It's not geological. There's something here. Something that's been waiting since 1966, the year they tried to tear a hole in the world. Dr. Carmichael was right about the research station. They didn't abandon it because of funding. They abandoned it because they succeeded. My blood turned to ice water. I knew about 1966. Every ranger in the area did, but it was classified, buried under layers of bureaucracy and NDAs. Some kind of government research project gone wrong. Officially, nothing had happened. Officially, there was no research station, but I was looking at it. If this story is giving you chills, smash that follow button for more supernatural horror. What would you do in Matthew's situation? Comment below. The clearing opened up ahead of me, and there it was, a concrete bunker maybe 40 feet across, set into the hillside like a gray wound. The metal door stood slightly ajar, darkness spilling out like liquid shadow. Above the entrance, stenciled in faded black letters, U.S. Depth of Defense, Project Terminus, ESTD 1966. I should have turned around, should have called for backup, for hazmat teams, for anyone with more authority and less curiosity than me. But Melissa had been in there. I knew it with the same certainty that I knew my own name. My flashlight beam seemed to get swallowed by the darkness inside. The air that drifted out tasted of ozone and something organic, something that had been rotting for decades but never quite died. My Geiger counter, standard equipment for this sector, began clicking frantically. I stepped inside. The hallway stretched further than should have been possible given the exterior dimensions of the bunker. Emergency lighting strips, their batteries somehow still functional after 53 years, cast a sickly green glow that made every shadow dance. The walls were covered with equations, not painted or carved, but burned directly into the concrete as if the mathematics itself had enough heat to scar reality. Room after room of abandoned equipment, computers that predated my birth, monitoring devices connected to sensors that led deeper underground, banks of recording equipment still running, their tape reels turning endlessly, and everywhere, paperwork. Thousands of documents scattered across desks, floors, pinned to walls. I started reading. Project Terminus classified beyond top secret objective. Dimensional breach research for strategic advantage. Lead researcher, Dr. Elena Vasquez. Status, abandoned. Immediate evacuation ordered. The files painted a picture of Cold War paranoia, taken to its logical extreme. In 1966, at the height of global tensions, a team of physicists had attempted to weaponize theoretical physics. They wanted to create doorways to parallel dimensions, seeking military advantage through access to alternate realities. They'd succeeded. But what came through wasn't an empty dimension or an alternate Earth. It was something that had been waiting in the spaces between worlds for eons. Something that experienced time differently, that existed in more dimensions than human minds could process. The final research log, dated December 23, 1966, was handwritten in increasingly erratic script. Day 847 of breach containment. The entity continues to grow. It doesn't communicate through language, but through direct alteration of reality. It's teaching us things, showing us equations that shouldn't work but do. Mathematics that hurt to understand. Jenkins tried to solve the 13th theorem in his mind. God, his mind just unraveled. We can hear him screaming, but he's been dead for 6 days. The entity isn't malevolent. It's worse than that. It's indifferent. To it, we're no more significant than bacteria, but it's curious about us. It keeps changing things, making small alterations to see how we respond. Yesterday, gravity flowed upward for 3 hours in Section C. Last week, Turner, aged 40 years in 17 minutes. We can't shut the breach. The mathematics have become autonomous, self-replicating. The equations are spreading beyond the containment area, carving themselves into trees, into rocks, into the minds of anyone who spends too long near the site. We're evacuating, sealing the facility, classifying everything beyond top secret. May God forgive us for what we've unleashed. Dr. E. Vasquez. My hand shook as I set down the file. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. The entity hadn't died or left. It had been waiting, learning, growing stronger. The magnetic anomalies, the off-limit zones, the strange incidents over the years, all of it centered around this place. And Melissa had found it. I descended deeper into the facility, following signs toward something called primary containment. The temperature dropped with each level, but not in any natural way. The cold came from the walls themselves, as if the concrete was leaching heat from reality. That's when I heard the voice, not speaking exactly. The words appeared directly in my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. They came with a sensation like ice picks sliding between my thoughts. Matthew. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through darkness that seemed to move independent of any light source. Nothing there. But I could feel something vast turning its attention to me, like standing in the shadow of a mountain that was looking down. You seek the female, the one who came to learn. Where is she? I asked aloud, surprised by how small my voice sounded. Where are all things that wander too close to truth? She became part of the equation, as will you. The hallway around me began to change. The walls stretched, the floor tilted at angles that made my inner ear scream. My flashlight revealed corridors branching off in directions that weren't quite forward, backward, left, or right. Directions that didn't have names in any human language. The year 1966 was when your species first touched the edge of real mathematics. Clumsy, primitive, but sufficient to crack the shell of your limited reality. I have been patient, learning, preparing. I stumbled forward, following a path that seemed to exist only when I wasn't looking directly at it. The entity's presence pressed against my consciousness, like a thumb against an eyeball. Do you understand why you returned, Matthew? You who fear no natural thing? That's when the horrible realization hit me. I hadn't come back because of dreams or guilt or professional obligation. I'd been called, summoned. The entity had been inside my head for weeks, maybe months, drawing me back like a fish on a line. Understanding, good. Understanding is the first step toward integration. The corridor opened into a vast chamber that couldn't possibly exist within the physical constraints of the bunker. The ceiling soared up into darkness, and the walls curved away into infinity. In the center of the space, suspended in something that wasn't quite light and wasn't quite shadow, was Melissa. She floated 3 feet above the ground, her eyes open but completely black. Not the iris and pupil, but the entire eye, as if filled with liquid night. Her mouth moved constantly, silently forming words in no language I recognized. Mathematical equations flickered across her skin like living tattoos, symbols that rearranged themselves even as I watched. She solved 17 of the theorems before her mind achieved sufficient flexibility. A remarkable specimen. She continues to process, to calculate, to understand. She is happy in ways your language cannot describe. Let her go. The words came out as a croak. Go implies movement through space-time as you understand it. She has transcended such limitations. She exists in all moments simultaneously. She is everywhere and everywhen that the mathematics touch. The entity's presence grew stronger, and I could feel my own thoughts beginning to fray at the edges. Images flooded my mind. Geometries that existed in 11 dimensions. Equations that describe the fundamental structure of consciousness itself. Truths about the nature of reality that human brains were never meant to process. You will join her. You will help complete the great equation. Together you will assist in the final calculation that will restructure your reality into something more efficient. I tried to run, but the concept of a way had stopped making sense. Every direction led back to the center of the chamber, to Melissa floating in her mathematical prison, to the entity that had been using her mind as a calculator for 3 years. Fear is irrelevant. Courage is irrelevant. All human emotions are merely electrochemical processes that will be optimized during integration. You will retain core functionality while serving a greater purpose. My vision began to fracture. I could see through walls, through time, through the thin membrane that separated this dimension from others. I saw 1966 in perfect clarity, the moment when Dr. Vasquez's team had torn a hole in reality and invited something ancient and terrible into our world. I saw the decades of patient growth, the entity learning human mathematics and finding them inadequate. I saw what it planned to do. The final equation wasn't just about restructuring local reality. It was about spreading outward, touching every human mind, every computer, every system that used mathematics, converting all of human civilization into components of a vast, multidimensional thinking machine. And it was almost complete. The female provided 93% of the necessary calculations. Your mind will provide the remaining 7%. After integration, the great work begins. But something in me, the part that had never feared natural predators, that had faced down charging bears and armed poachers, that part refused to break. I'd spent 15 years in these woods. They were my territory, my responsibility. And nobody, not even cosmic entities from beyond space-time, was going to turn my forest into a goddamn computer. I pulled out my emergency flare gun, standard equipment that seemed ridiculously inadequate against something that existed in multiple dimensions. But I wasn't aiming at the entity. I was aiming at the support beams I could see through my fractured, reality-piercing vision, the ones holding up the sections of the bunker that still existed in normal three-dimensional space. No, you do not understand. Physical destruction cannot. I fired. The magnesium flare punched through 50-year-old concrete and struck the main power coupling for the dimensional breach equipment. The explosion, when it came, wasn't just physical, it was mathematical. Equations that had been self-sustaining for decades suddenly lost their structural integrity. Reality snapped back like a rubber band. The last thing I saw was Melissa falling from her suspended state, her eyes flickering back to normal brown, her mouth forming a single word. Run. Then the bunker collapsed. I woke up 3 days later in a Minneapolis hospital, severely hypothermic with a concussion and no memory of how I'd gotten out of the woods. The official report stated that I'd fallen into an abandoned mine shaft. No mention of government facilities or dimensional entities. But I remember. Melissa's body was never found. The search teams reported that the entire area had been geologically restructured by some kind of underground collapse. The sector was permanently closed to public access. I retired from the Forest Service 6 months later. Early pension, medical discharge due to stress-related psychological trauma. They offered counseling, medication, all the standard support for rangers who'd seen too much. I didn't take any of it, because sometimes late at night I can still feel something vast and patient pressing against the edges of reality. The 1966 breach wasn't destroyed, just disrupted. Temporarily, and mathematics are patient things. They grow, they spread, they wait for the right conditions to reassert themselves, and sometimes, when I'm checking my bank balance or calculating my grocery bill, I catch myself working out equations that I've never seen before. Elegant, beautiful theorems that hurt to understand but feel absolutely, fundamentally correct. I think Melissa might still be out there, somewhere between dimensions, still calculating, still trying to complete the great equation. I think she's waiting for me. Holy hell, that was intense. Did that ending blow your mind? Like, if you want more terrifying Ranger stories, follow for daily supernatural horror. And comment your theory about what really happened to Melissa. I read every single one. My name is Daniel, and the broken voice of Rachel's mother on the phone still echoes in my head 3 days later. Please, she had sobbed. You're the only one who believes she's still alive. The others, they've given up. But you understand, don't you? You have to find my baby girl. I should have said no, Should have explained that when a 22-year-old psychology student vanishes without a trace in the Cascade Range for over 72 hours, the odds shift from rescue to recovery. Should have told Mrs. Chen that her daughter's abandoned campsite, with the tent still zipped shut and her sleeping bag still warm to the touch, pointed to something far worse than getting lost on a day hike. But I didn't, because I'm Daniel Morrison, the ranger the others call Encyclopedia Dan behind my back. The guy who memorizes trail maps for fun and knows the Latin names of every tree species in Washington state. The guy whose colleagues roll their eyes when I mention something I read in a forensic anthropology journal. The guy who notices details others miss, but whose theories get dismissed because I'm overthinking it. Not this time. This time, my obsessive attention to detail was going to save Rachel Chen's life. The October morning air bit through my ranger jacket as I adjusted the straps on my 70-pound pack, checking my gear for the fourth time. Garmin GPS unit, backup compass, emergency beacon, first aid kit, water purification tablets, headlamp with extra batteries, and my department-issued radio that had been crackling with static all morning. The weather forecast called for a temperature drop to 38 degrees after sunset, and the barometric pressure was falling fast. Storm conditions that could turn this search from difficult to deadly. My smartphone showed 2 bars of signal strength at the trailhead parking lot, but I knew that would disappear within the first mile. Mrs. Chen's last text message to me was still displayed on the cracked screen. "Any news? Please tell me you found something." Anything. I hadn't found anything. Not yet. But I had theories. Lots of theories. Rachel's abandoned campsite was located at GPS coordinates 47.751 Lum degree on N, 121.1531 degree on W, approximately 2.3 miles northeast of the Snoqualmie Pass area, at an elevation of 3,147 feet. The site showed no signs of animal predation, no evidence of struggle, no indication of hasty departure. Her north face tent remained perfectly pitched, guy lines taut, rain fly properly secured. Inside, her MacBook Pro was still open to a psychology research paper about cult manipulation tactics, a detail that made my analytical brain itch with significance, though my supervisor had dismissed it as coincidence. The coffee in my thermos tasted bitter, metallic with the aftertaste of fear and too little sleep. I'd been running on caffeine and determination for 3 days, catching maybe 4 hours of rest back at the ranger station, before Mrs. Chen's call pulled me back into the forest. My wife Sarah had stopped asking when I'd be home. Our 8-year-old daughter Emma had drawn me a picture of a forest ranger finding a missing princess, a crayon masterpiece now folded in my breast pocket, next to my heart, reminding me why this job mattered. The Cascade Mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, a maze of ravines, old-growth forests, and abandoned logging roads that could hide secrets for decades. I'd studied topographical maps until my eyes burned, cross-referenced weather patterns, analyzed wildlife migration routes, and created search grids that my colleagues called unnecessarily complex. But complexity was what found people. Details were what brought them home alive. At 8:47 a.m., I keyed my radio and checked in with dispatch. "Base, this is Unit 23, beginning Sector 7 sweep, coordinates 47.7489 north, 121.1478 west. Weather conditions overcast, temperature 42 degrees, wind southwest at 8 miles per hour." "Copy that, Unit 23. You're authorized for extended patrol. Check in every 2 hours." The trail wound through old-growth Douglas fir and western red cedar, their canopy so dense that my headlamp was necessary even in daylight. The forest floor crunched under my boots, a carpet of pine needles, fallen leaves, and the occasional crack of deadfall that made my pulse spike every time. Sound traveled strangely here, absorbed by the thick vegetation until even my own breathing seemed unnaturally loud. I was looking for 3 things: footprints, disturbed vegetation, and what I called human sign, anything that indicated Rachel had passed through this area. A broken branch at shoulder height, a thread caught on bark, a boot print preserved in mud, the kind of evidence that required stopping every 50 feet, crouching down, examining the ground through a magnifying glass like some kind of forest detective. Which is exactly what I was doing when I heard voices. Human voices, speaking in hushed tones, somewhere ahead on the trail. My heart rate spiked from its steady hiking rhythm to something approaching panic mode. In 3 days of searching, I hadn't encountered another soul in this remote section of forest. The voices were male and female, conversational, almost cheerful. I slipped off the main trail, moving parallel through the underbrush, using the thick tree trunks for cover. My ranger training included basic stealth techniques: how to approach potentially dangerous wildlife without spooking them, how to observe without being observed. The skills translated surprisingly well to approaching potentially dangerous humans. Through the trees, I could make out 2 figures, a middle-aged couple, both wearing clean hiking clothes that looked fresh from an REI catalog. The woman had graying blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing a red fleece jacket and dark hiking pants. The man was tall, bearded, dressed in earth tones that should have helped him blend into the forest environment, but somehow made him stand out more. They were standing near a wooden sign that marked the junction of Trail 1032 and an unnamed logging road. They were looking at a map. "Excuse me," I called out, stepping back onto the trail with my hands visible, projecting the kind of authoritative friendliness that usually puts civilians at ease. "Forest Service, I'm conducting a search and rescue operation in this area. Have you folks seen any other hikers today?" The couple turned toward me with identical smiles that reached their eyes, the kind of genuine warmth that made me immediately feel guilty for approaching them with suspicion. "Oh, thank goodness," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight southern accent. "We were just saying we hoped we'd run into a ranger. I'm Margaret, and this is my husband Tom. We're a little bit turned around, to be honest." Tom folded their map with practiced efficiency. "We're experienced hikers, but these old logging roads aren't marked on our GPS. We've been trying to get back to the main trailhead for about an hour now." I studied their faces, looking for the telltale signs of deception I'd learned to recognize during my psychology minor. Micro-expressions of anxiety, inconsistent eye contact, fidgeting behavior. Instead, I saw exactly what they presented: a lost but optimistic couple who'd bitten off more than they could chew. "No problem," I said, pulling out my own map. "You're here at the junction of Trail 1032 and Forest Service Road 142. The main parking area is about 2.7 miles southwest of your current position." I traced the route with my finger. "But I have to ask, have you seen anyone else out here? A young Asian woman, early 20s, probably wearing hiking clothes?" Margaret's expression shifted to concern. "Oh my, no. Are you looking for someone who's lost?" "Missing person case," I confirmed. "Rachel Chen disappeared from a campsite about 3 miles from here 3 days ago. Her family is..." I swallowed the emotion that tried to creep into my professional demeanor. "They're pretty worried." Tom and Margaret exchanged a look that lasted a split second longer than it should have. "That's terrible," Tom said. "We haven't seen anyone, but we'll definitely keep our eyes open. Is there anything we can do to help?" This was the moment where I should have politely declined and continued my search, where I should have given them directions back to the trailhead and moved on with my systematic grid pattern, where my analytical mind should have registered the slight pause before Tom spoke, the way Margaret's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. Instead, I found myself saying, "Actually, yeah. If you're familiar with this area, you might know some of the unofficial trails, places someone might go if they wanted to get away from everything." "Absolutely," Margaret said. "We've been hiking these mountains for 15 years. We know every deer path and creek bed. Why don't you come back to our cabin? We can show you some topographical maps that aren't in the ranger system, have a hot meal, and plan out a search strategy." The offer hit every desperate button in my psyche. Hot food, detailed local knowledge, a chance to actually make progress instead of wandering through endless trees following search patterns that had yielded nothing but false hope and growing dread. "That's very generous," I said. "But I should probably..." "Nonsense," Tom interrupted. "You look like you've been out here for days. When's the last time you had a real meal, or a full night's sleep?" The answer was longer than I wanted to admit. My stomach growled audibly, betraying me. Margaret laughed, a genuine sound of maternal concern. "That settles it. Our cabin is only about a half-mile from here, just off the old logging road. We insist. If this story is giving you chills, smash that follow button for more supernatural horror. What would you do in Daniel's situation? Comment below. Every rational part of my brain screamed warnings. Don't deviate from search protocol. Don't accept food from strangers. Don't follow unknown civilians to secondary locations. But the emotional part, the part that heard Mrs. Chen's broken voice begging me not to give up, drowned out the rational warnings. These people wanted to help. They knew the area. They had resources I didn't. Okay, I said, but I need to radio in my location change first. I keyed my radio, but instead of the usual static, I got nothing. Dead air. Radio's been spotty all morning, I muttered, shaking the device. Must be the storm front moving in. No problem, Tom said. We've got a landline at the cabin, old-fashioned copper wire system that works even when the cell towers go down. That should have been reassuring. Instead, something cold crawled up my spine. A primitive warning system that my analytical mind immediately tried to rationalize away. I was tired, stressed, emotionally compromised. Of course I was feeling paranoid. The walk to their cabin took exactly 23 minutes following a deer trail that branched off from the logging road. I counted steps out of habit, noted landmarks, maintained my GPS tracking even though the signal was getting weaker. The forest seemed to grow quieter as we walked. The usual sounds of birds and small mammals fading until there was nothing but the crunch of our footsteps on fallen leaves. Their cabin materialized out of the trees like something from a fairy tale. A rustic A-frame structure with solar panels on the roof, a stone chimney trailing wood smoke, and windows that glowed warm yellow in the dim forest light. It looked exactly like the kind of place where helpful locals would offer aid to a lost ranger. "Welcome to our little slice of paradise," Margaret said, opening the front door. "Tom built most of it himself. We're completely off-grid here, but we've got everything we need." The interior was cozy in a way that made my paranoia seem ridiculous. Handcrafted furniture, colorful quilts, the smell of something delicious simmering on a wood-burning stove. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with what looked like classic literature and nature guides. A chess set sat half-finished on a coffee table carved from a single piece of cedar. "Have a seat," Tom said, gesturing to a leather recliner positioned near the fireplace. "Margaret makes the best vegetable stew this side of the Continental Divide." I should have remained standing, should have maintained professional alertness, should have asked to use their phone immediately. Instead, I sank into the recliner and felt my muscles relax for the first time in 3 days. The warmth from the fire seemed to penetrate straight to my bones. Margaret bustled around the kitchen, humming softly. "Tom, get Daniel one of those beers from the root cellar, and show him the maps while I finish dinner." Tom disappeared through a door I hadn't noticed before, returning with a bottle of local craft beer and an armload of rolled topographical maps. "These are survey maps from the 1970s, he explained, spreading them across the coffee table. "They show things that aren't on modern GPS systems, old mining claims, abandoned settlements, cave systems." I leaned forward, my analytical mind immediately engaged. These maps were incredibly detailed, showing geological features, water sources, and human structures that didn't appear on any Forest Service documentation. If Rachel had stumbled across one of these forgotten places. "This is amazing," I said, tracing elevation lines with my finger. "Where did you get these?" "Tom used to work for the Forest Service," Margaret called from the kitchen. "Way back in the day, he kept copies of everything." Something in her tone made me look up. "Really? When was that?" Tom's smile never wavered. "Oh, long time ago. Different era. Things were different then." I took a sip of the beer, which had a strange aftertaste. Not unpleasant, just unusual. Probably a local brewery I wasn't familiar with. The alcohol hit my empty stomach immediately, spreading warmth through my chest and making the cabin feel even more welcoming. "So tell us about Rachel," Margaret said, ladling stew into a ceramic bowl. "What kind of person is she? What might she have been thinking when she disappeared?" The question struck me as oddly specific, but I found myself answering anyway. Maybe it was the beer. or the exhaustion, or just the relief of having someone actually listen to my theories instead of dismissing them. "She's a psychology student," I said. "Graduate program at University of Washington. Smart girl, really smart. Her laptop had research about cult psychology, manipulation tactics, social isolation techniques. I think she might have been researching something specific." Tom and Margaret exchanged another one of those looks. "Cult psychology," Tom mused. "Interesting area of study. What kind of cults was she researching?" I was starting to feel drowsy, the warmth and alcohol and 3 days of poor sleep catching up with me all at once. Pacific Northwest groups mostly, historical stuff. There were some religious communes in these mountains back in the 60s and 70s. Most of them disbanded, but some didn't, Margaret finished, setting the bowl of stew in front of me. The stew smelled incredible, rich, savory, with herbs I couldn't identify. My stomach cramped with hunger, reminding me I hadn't eaten anything substantial since yesterday morning's granola bar. "This looks amazing," I said, lifting the spoon. "Thank you so much for—" The lights went out. Complete darkness, sudden and absolute. The only illumination came from the fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls that made everything look distorted, sinister. "Don't worry," Tom's voice came from somewhere to my left, calm and reassuring. "Happens all the time out here. Storm must be moving in faster than expected." But there was no sound of wind outside, no rain, no thunder. And in the firelight, I could see that Tom and Margaret were both smiling. Not the warm, helpful smiles from before. Something else. Something that made my hands start shaking as I set down the spoon. "You know," Margaret said conversationally, "it's funny that you mentioned Rachel's research. We're quite familiar with the history of religious communities in these mountains." My radio crackled to life, not with dispatch, but with a voice I recognized. Rachel's voice. "Help me," the radio whispered. "Please, someone help me. They're going to—" The transmission cut to static. I lurched to my feet, nearly knocking over the stew bowl, my hand instinctively reaching for the radio on my belt, but my movements felt sluggish, like I was moving through thick water. The beer. Something had been in the beer. "Where is she?" I demanded, though my voice sounded slurred even to my own ears. "Where's Rachel?" Tom stood up slowly, and in the firelight, his helpful demeanor melted away like a mask being removed. "She's safe, Daniel. Very safe. Just like you're going to be." Margaret moved to block the door, her matronly smile replaced by something cold and calculating. "We've been watching you for 3 days, you know, following your search pattern, waiting for the right moment." "You see," Tom continued, "Rachel wasn't researching historical cults. She was researching us, current, active communities. She got a little too close to the truth." The cabin seemed to be spinning around me, or maybe I was spinning. I fumbled for my service weapon, but my fingers couldn't work the retention holster. Whatever they'd given me was shutting down my motor functions one system at a time. "The thing about smart people like you and Rachel," Margaret said, "is that you think knowledge will save you. You think if you understand something, you can control it." I tried to key my radio to call for help, but my hands wouldn't obey my commands. The device slipped from my numb fingers and clattered to the floor. "But some things," Tom said, "are meant to be experienced, not understood." Through the growing haze of whatever drug they'd given me, I could hear sounds coming from beneath the cabin. Voices, multiple voices, chanting in harmony. And underneath that, muffled screaming that might have been Rachel. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was Margaret lighting candles around the room. Dozens of them, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. In their flickering light, the helpful couple's faces looked like something from a medieval painting of demons. "Welcome to our community, Daniel," Margaret whispered as consciousness slipped away. "You're going to help us with a very special ceremony." I woke up in hell. Not the metaphorical hell of realizing I'd made a catastrophic mistake, but an actual subterranean chamber that reeked of sulfur, decay, and something far worse than death. The air was thick and humid, like breathing through wet cloth, and every surface seemed to pulse with a sickly organic warmth. I was tied to a wooden chair with rope that felt sticky against my skin, my arms pulled behind my back at an angle that sent shooting pains through my shoulders. The drug had worn off enough for me to regain consciousness, but my head felt stuffed with cotton and my thoughts moved like sludge. Candles, hundreds of them, arranged in concentric circles around what looked like an altar carved from black stone. The light danced across rough-hewn walls that disappeared into shadows above, suggesting a cavern far larger than the cabin's basement should have been able to contain. And the smell. God, the smell. It wasn't just sulfur and decay. It was something else. Something that made my hindbrain scream warnings that my rational mind couldn't process. The smell of something fundamentally wrong. Something that violated basic laws of reality just by existing. "Daniel!" The voice came from my left, weak but unmistakably familiar. "Daniel, is that you?" Rachel Chen sat tied to an identical chair about 10 feet away, her clothes torn and dirty, her face bruised but her eyes blazing with intelligence and fury. She was alive. Against all odds, after 4 days missing in the wilderness, she was alive and conscious, and looking at me like I was either salvation or the biggest fool in Washington state. Probably both. "Rachel?" I croaked, my voice barely functional. "Jesus Christ, I found you." "No," she said with bitter precision. "They found you. Just like they found me when I got too close to the truth about what really happened to the Sunshine Family commune in 1977. The Sunshine Family. I remembered that name from a true crime podcast Sarah liked to listen to, a hippie religious group that had supposedly disbanded after their leader died in a climbing accident. 37 members had simply vanished from their compound, leaving behind all their possessions and no forwarding addresses. "They didn't disband," Rachel continued, reading my expression. "They went underground, literally. And they've been down here for 46 years practicing their religion." Footsteps echoed from somewhere in the darkness above us. Multiple sets, descending what sounded like stone stairs. My heart rate spiked as the candlelight revealed figures emerging from the shadows. Not just Tom and Margaret, but others. Men and women of various ages, all wearing simple brown robes, all carrying the same expression of serene contentment that I'd seen on the couple's faces back at the cabin. There were at least a dozen of them, maybe more lurking in the darkness beyond the candles. Tom and Margaret stood at the front of the group, now dressed in identical robes, their helpful civilian personas completely abandoned. "Welcome to our congregation, Daniel," Tom said, his voice carrying an authority that hadn't been present during our trail encounter. "I'm Father Thomas and this is Mother Margaret. We've been the spiritual leaders of this community since 1981. "Let her go," I said, struggling against the ropes. "Rachel hasn't done anything to you people." Mother Margaret laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, but she has. She's been asking questions, sending emails to journalists, making inquiries with the FBI about missing persons cases dating back to the 70s. "Someone had to," Rachel said defiantly. 43 people have disappeared in this area over the past 4 decades. Hikers, campers, researchers, all of them last seen on trails that lead to this section of forest. 43 people. My analytical mind tried to process that number, to understand the scope of what we'd stumbled into. A serial killing operation spanning nearly half a century, disguised as a religious community, hidden beneath the Cascade Mountains where no one would think to look. Not killed, Father Thomas corrected as if reading my thoughts. Transformed, elevated, brought into communion with forces beyond human understanding. He gestured to the altar, and for the first time I noticed what sat upon it, not a cross or religious symbol, but something that made my eyes water to look at directly. A twisted sculpture of metal and bone that seemed to writhe in the candlelight, that suggested geometries impossible in 3-dimensional space. The old ones walked this earth long before humanity crawled from the primordial soup, Mother Margaret explained, in the tone of a kindergarten teacher describing basic arithmetic. They left behind guidance, instructions, for those wise enough to listen. "You're completely insane," I said, which in retrospect was probably not the most diplomatic response to give a group of cultists holding me captive in an underground lair. Father Thomas smiled with infinite patience. That's what they all say initially. The rational mind rebels against truth that transcends its limited understanding. But you'll learn, Daniel, just as the others learned. What others? Rachel asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. Mother Margaret gestured to the shadows beyond the candlelight. Would you like to meet them? More figures stepped into the flickering light, men and women wearing the same brown robes, but these moved with an odd, shuffling gait that sent ice water through my veins. Their faces were visible under their hoods, but wrong somehow, as if the basic architecture of human features had been adjusted. Their eyes reflected the candlelight like an animal's. The transformation is beautiful, Father Thomas whispered. The shedding of human limitations. The expansion of consciousness beyond the boundaries of individual identity. Some resist longer than others, but eventually, everyone finds peace in the collective. I counted at least 20 of them, these transformed followers, standing at the edges of the candlelight like living shadows. How many had been hikers like Rachel? How many had been rangers like me, lured away from their duties by helpful strangers with detailed maps and hot meals? The ceremony begins at midnight, Mother Margaret announced, checking an antique pocket watch. We have perhaps an hour to prepare our guests. Two of the transformed approached my chair, their movements silent and coordinated. Up close, I could see that their faces weren't just wrong, they were changing, shifting, features flowing like soft wax in the heat of the candles. Don't let them touch you, Rachel screamed as similar figures surrounded her. Daniel, whatever happens, don't let them. Her words cut off as one of the creatures placed a hand over her mouth. Not violently, almost gently, but where its fingers touched her skin, I could see small changes beginning. Tiny alterations in pigmentation, in bone structure, in the basic humanity of her features. The transformation was contagious, transmitted by touch, and they were reaching for me with hands that no longer looked entirely human. This was it. This was how 43 people had disappeared over 4 decades. Not murdered, but absorbed, converted, made into something else. Something that served this underground community and their impossible altar. I thought of Emma's drawing in my breast pocket, of Sarah waiting at home, probably calling the ranger station to ask when I'd be back, of Mrs. Chen's broken voice begging me not to give up on her daughter. I thought of every missing person case I'd ever read about, every family left without answers, every search that ended in failure and unanswered questions. And I got angry. Not the hot, impulsive anger of desperation, but the cold, calculating fury of a man whose analytical mind had just figured out how to turn intelligence into a weapon. Wait, I said loudly, staring directly at Father Thomas. Before you start your ceremony, I need to tell you something about why Rachel was really researching you. The transformed figures paused, hands inches from my skin. She wasn't working alone, I continued, putting every ounce of conviction I could muster into my voice. She was part of a team, FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit. They've been tracking ritualistic disappearances across the Pacific Northwest for 3 years. Father Thomas's expression shifted from serene confidence to sharp attention. You're lying. Am I? I met his gaze steadily. Then explain why Rachel had bureau credentials in her tent. Explain why her research was so detailed, so specific. You think a graduate student just stumbles across 40-year-old commune records by accident? It was a complete fabrication, but it was a fabrication built on details I'd actually observed. Rachel's research had been unusually thorough. Her laptop had contained files that seemed too sophisticated for academic work. And most importantly, these people had survived for decades by being careful, paranoid, thorough in their selection of victims. I was betting their paranoia would work against them. She's been sending encrypted reports to her handler every 24 hours, I pressed on. When she missed her last check-in 4 days ago, they activated a full task force. They know about this location. He's lying, Mother Margaret said. But there was uncertainty in her voice. Maybe, Father Thomas agreed. But if he's not? The transformed figures stepped back from both our chairs. I could see the cult leader's mind working, weighing risks, calculating probabilities. These people hadn't survived 40 years by taking chances with federal law enforcement. Even if that were true, he said finally, it doesn't matter. The ceremony must proceed. The old ones demand... He never finished the sentence. The explosion came from above, a thunderous crash that shook dust from the cavern ceiling and sent several candles toppling over. Emergency lighting flooded the chamber, harsh white LEDs that made the cultists shield their eyes and revealed the full scope of the underground complex. FBI, everybody on the ground now! The voice boomed through the cavern with electronic amplification, followed by the sound of boots on stone stairs, tactical equipment clanking, radio chatter echoing off the walls. It was impossible. It was miraculous. It was... Daniel? Rachel? Sound off if you can hear us. That voice. I knew that voice. Sarah, I shouted at the top of my lungs. Down here. My wife's voice coming from the stairway, directing what sounded like a full tactical team. How is that possible? Sarah was a high school math teacher, not a federal agent. She didn't even like camping. But I didn't have time to process the impossibility, because the cultists were moving, not fleeing, as I'd expected, not surrendering to superior firepower. Instead, they were converging on the altar, their movements urgent and coordinated, chanting in a language that made my teeth ache just hearing it. The ceremony! Father Thomas screamed over the tactical team's shouts. Complete the ceremony. They cannot stop what has already begun. The transformed followers grabbed Rachel and me, our chairs and all, dragging us toward the writhing sculpture on the altar. Up close, the thing was even worse than I'd imagined. Not made of metal and bone, but something that might have been metal and bone once before being changed into something that violated basic laws of physics. It was growing larger. Daniel. Rachel's voice, strained but determined. The rope, work on the rope. My hands. While I'd been talking, while I'd been distracting them with fabricated stories about FBI task forces, I'd been working methodically at the knots binding my wrists. 3 days of obsessive finger exercises, of testing my bonds, of applying pressure at precise angles. The rope gave way just as they reached the altar. I was free, but freedom didn't mean much when surrounded by 24 cultists and their transformed followers, all chanting in harmony while that impossible sculpture pulsed with increasing energy. The tactical lights above were flickering now, as if whatever was happening at the altar was interfering with electronic equipment. I grabbed the nearest candle, a thick pillar of black wax that felt unnaturally heavy, and smashed it across the face of the transformed cultist holding Rachel's chair. The thing that had once been human screamed, a sound like steam escaping from a burst pipe, and released its grip. But instead of falling down, instead of bleeding, it began to melt. Literally melt, like the wax from the candle, pooling into a puddle of organic matter that continued to writhe and pulse with fading life. The wax! Rachel shouted, working frantically at her own ropes. It's blessed, consecrated. It burns them. I didn't question the logistics of how cultists had ended up with consecrated candles in their ritual chamber. I just grabbed more candles, as many as I could carry, and started throwing them at every transformed figure I could reach. Each impact produced the same horrifying result: screaming, melting, dissolution into puddles of animate matter. But for every one I destroyed, 2 more emerged from the shadows, and meanwhile the chanting was getting louder. The sculpture on the altar was definitely bigger now and starting to take on a more definite shape. Something with too many angles, too many surfaces that folded back on themselves in ways that hurt to contemplate. Something that suggested vastness beyond the physical dimensions of the cavern. Something that was answering the call. Daniel, where are you? Sarah's voice again, much closer now. I could see tactical lights sweeping the upper levels of the cavern, hear boots on stone, but they seemed impossibly far away. Here, I screamed back. At the altar. But my voice was swallowed by the chanting, which had reached a crescendo that made the air itself vibrate. The cultists were no longer paying attention to Rachel and me. All their focus was on the sculpture, which had grown large enough to cast shadows that moved independently of the candlelight. This was it. Whatever they were summoning, whatever impossible entity they'd been serving for 40 years, it was about to manifest. And then Rachel did something extraordinary. She stood up, somehow free from her own ropes, walked directly to the altar, and placed both hands on the writhing sculpture. The chanting stopped instantly. Every cultist, transformed or not, froze in place and stared at her with expressions of absolute horror. "You stupid, pathetic little parasites," Rachel said in a voice that carried harmonics no human throat should have been able to produce. "Did you really think you were calling us?" The sculpture beneath her hands began to crack, black ichor seeping from the fractures. "We've been calling you." Holy hell, that was intense. Did that ending blow your mind? Like, if you want more terrifying Ranger stories, follow for daily supernatural horror, and comment your theory about what really happened to Rachel. I read every single one. The official Forest Service report listed Daniel Morrison and Rachel Chen as missing, presumed dead, after a landslide sealed the entrance to an unmapped cave system in the Cascade Range. The tactical team Sarah Morrison claimed to have led was never identified, and no federal agencies acknowledged running an operation in that area. The Chen family received a letter from Rachel 3 months later, postmarked from a small town in Oregon, saying she was safe and continuing her research. Daniel's family received no such letter. But sometimes, late at night, hikers in the Cascades report hearing voices on their radios, a man and woman, speaking in calm, professional tones, offering help to lost travelers, giving directions to a cabin just off the old logging road, where a friendly couple waits with hot meals and detailed maps. The Forest Service advises against following these directions. Some offers of help, they say, come with too high a price. My name is Robert, and I saw Elizabeth disappear 3 meters ahead of me on the trail before she simply vanished. That was 6 hours ago, and I'm still trying to make sense of what happened. I'm a rookie ranger at Pisgah National Forest, North Carolina. Been on the job exactly 4 months and 12 days. This was supposed to be a routine patrol of the Cradle of Forestry trail system. Easy assignment for the new guy, they said. Walk the marked paths, check the campsites, radio in every hour. Nothing complicated. Elizabeth Martinez, 23 years old, was hiking solo with a red Osprey backpack and GPS tracker. I'd checked her permit that morning. She seemed experienced, confident, planning to camp at the designated site near Looking Glass Falls. Brown hair and a ponytail, wearing a blue fleece and hiking boots that looked well broken in. We were walking the same direction on Trail 475 when it happened. I was maybe 10 feet behind her, close enough to hear her humming some pop song I didn't recognize. The forest was typical for late October 2018. Crisp air, leaves crunching underfoot, that golden afternoon light filtering through the canopy. Then she just wasn't there anymore. No scream, no sound of branches breaking or rocks tumbling. 1 second I could see her red backpack bobbing ahead of me. The next I was staring at empty trail. Like she'd been edited out of reality. I ran to the spot where she'd been walking. Her footprints were still there in the soft earth, size 7 hiking boots with distinctive zigzag treads, but they just stopped. No sign of struggle, no drag marks, no indication she'd stepped off the trail. The prints literally ended mid-stride, as if she'd been plucked straight up into the air. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my radio. Unit 23 to base, this is Robert Chen, badge number 447. I have a possible missing hiker on Trail 475. Coordinates 35.2968 degree north, 82.7871 degree west. Request immediate assistance. The response crackled back through static. Copy that, Unit 23. Can you describe the circumstances? How do you describe someone vanishing into thin air? How do you tell your supervisor on your first big case that you lost a hiker who was right in front of you? Hiker was on trail ahead of me, lost visual contact, can't locate, I managed. Beginning immediate search pattern. I spent the next 3 hours grid searching the area, calling Elizabeth's name until my throat was raw. Used my GPS to mark every section I'd covered, followed protocol to the letter. Found nothing. not even a broken branch or a scrap of fabric. By sunset, the full search and rescue team had arrived. Dogs, thermal imaging, the works. They treated me with the polite courtesy reserved for rookie rangers who'd somehow screwed up their first real emergency. I could see it in their eyes. How do you lose someone who was 3 meters in front of you? The search continued through the night and into the next day. Elizabeth's parents drove down from Charlotte, clutching photos of their daughter, asking me over and over to describe exactly what I'd seen. Her mother kept saying, "She's so careful, she always checks in every few hours," while staring at me like I held the answer to some impossible equation. By the third day, the official search was scaled back. The dogs had found no scent trail. The helicopters had spotted nothing from above. It was like Elizabeth Martinez had simply ceased to exist on Trail 475. But I couldn't let it go. See, there was something I hadn't told anyone. Something I'd noticed in that moment before Elizabeth disappeared, but dismissed as a trick of light through the trees. About 50 yards off the trail, barely visible through the thick forest, I'd glimpsed something that shouldn't have been there. A church steeple. Pisgah National Forest is pristine wilderness. No buildings, no structures except for ranger stations and designated campsites. Definitely no churches. But I could swear I'd seen a pointed spire rising above the canopy, maybe quarter-mile to the northwest. On my 4th day of solo searching, officially off-duty but unable to sleep or eat or think about anything else, I decided to investigate. I bushwhacked through dense undergrowth, following my compass northwest from Elizabeth's last known position. The forest grew stranger as I walked. The trees seemed older here, more twisted. Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds, even though we were too far north for Spanish moss. The air smelled wrong. Not pine and earth, but something sweet and rotten like flowers on a grave. After 20 minutes of difficult hiking, I found it. The Church of Sacred Blood sat in a small clearing, as if the forest had recoiled from its presence. It was old, really old, built from dark stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Gothic architecture with pointed arches and narrow windows, but wrong somehow. The proportions were off, like it had been designed by someone who'd heard about churches but never actually seen one. Most unsettling was how well preserved it looked. No signs of weather damage or decay, despite being abandoned in the middle of a national forest. The heavy wooden doors stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. I checked my GPS. According to the device, I was standing in empty forest. No structures, no clearings, nothing but trees marked on the topographical map. But the church was right there in front of me, solid and undeniable. My radio crackled with static. I tried to call it in, but could only get broken fragments of transmission. Unit 23 to ksh, found structure, ksh, coordinates 3529, ksh. The static cleared and I heard something that made my blood freeze. A voice coming through my radio, but not from base station. A young woman's voice, distant and distorted. "Robert? Robert, I'm in here. I'm trapped. Please help me." Elizabeth's voice. "If this story is giving you chills, smash that follow button for more supernatural horror. What would you do in Robert's situation? Comment below." I approached the church doors on unsteady legs. The sweet rotten smell grew stronger, mixed now with something that reminded me of burned incense. My hiking boots crunched on scattered debris, broken glass, scraps of paper, things I didn't want to look at too closely. "Elizabeth?" I called out. "Elizabeth, is that you?" The darkness beyond the doors seemed to pulse, like it was breathing. I pulled out my LED flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the blackness, revealing the church interior. It was wrong. Everything was wrong. The pews had been arranged in concentric circles rather than rows, all facing inward toward what should have been the altar. But instead of a cross or pulpit, there was a stone slab stained with dark brown patches. The walls were covered in symbols that hurt to look at. Not quite pentagrams, not quite anything recognizable, but somehow familiar in the worst way. And hanging from the ceiling, suspended by chains, were dozens of objects that swayed gently in the still air. At first glance, they looked like wind chimes or decorations. But as my flashlight beam swept over them, I realized they were personal belongings. Wallets, jewelry, pieces of clothing. A red osprey backpack hung directly above the altar. "Elizabeth!" I shouted, rushing into the church. "Where are you?" My voice echoed strangely in the space, multiplying and distorting until it sounded like a dozen people calling her name. The echoes seemed to come from everywhere. The walls, the ceiling, even from beneath the stone floor. I reached for the backpack, but it was too high to grab. As I stood there, shining my light up at it, I heard something that made my skin crawl. Whispering. It came from all around me. Dozens of voices murmuring in languages I didn't recognize. But occasionally, I caught fragments of English. "Found the sacred place. Given to the congregation. Join us in eternal worship." The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and I began to understand what they were saying. This wasn't an abandoned church. It was still active. The congregation had been meeting here for over a century, ever since Reverend Matthias Blackwood led his followers into the wilderness in 1897. They'd built their church far from civilization, where they could practice their particular brand of worship without interference from conventional Christianity. Their services had grown more elaborate over the years, more inclusive. They believed that God demanded sacrifice, that salvation could only be achieved through suffering, and the forest provided plenty of lost hikers to test their faith. Elizabeth wasn't the first. The personal belongings hanging from the ceiling belonged to dozens of missing people, stretching back decades. Hikers, campers, hunters, anyone who wandered too far from the marked trails and stumbled upon the sacred place. But the congregation needed more than just random visitors. They needed someone to serve as shepherd, to guide new members to the church, someone with authority, with a badge and radio and official capacity to lead the lost sheep home, someone like a forest ranger. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound that made my heart hammer against my ribs. Footsteps. Slow, measured, coming from deeper in the church, from behind the altar. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, gaunt, wearing the black robes of a minister. His face was ancient, skin like yellowed parchment, but his eyes burned with fanatical intensity. "Welcome, Ranger Chen," he said, and his voice was the sound of wind through dead leaves. "We've been expecting you." Behind him came others, men and women in similar robes, their faces hidden by deep hoods. They moved with eerie synchronization, forming a circle around me. I counted 12 figures, 13 including the minister. A coven, a congregation, a family of predators who'd been hunting in these woods for over a century. "Where is she?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where's Elizabeth?" Reverend Blackwood smiled, revealing teeth filed to sharp points. "She is with us, of course. She has joined our eternal service, as will you." The hooded figures began to chant in that foreign language, their voices creating a harmonic resonance that seemed to vibrate through the stone floor and into my bones. The symbols on the walls began to glow with pale, sickly light. That's when I noticed something that nearly broke my sanity. The congregation members weren't just wearing robes. As they moved, I caught glimpses underneath the fabric. Their legs were wrong, bent at impossible angles, ending not in feet, but in something else. Hooves, claws, things that clicked and scratched against the stone floor. These weren't people anymore. Maybe they had been once, decades or centuries ago, but their devotion had changed them, transformed them into something between human and beast, predator and priest, and they wanted me to join them. "The forest provides," Reverend Blackwood intoned, raising his arms toward the ceiling. "The sacred grove gives us sustenance, and we give it offerings in return, blood for blessing, souls for salvation." The chanting grew louder, and I felt something tugging at the edges of my consciousness. A compulsion to kneel, to bow my head, to accept whatever they wanted to do to me. The symbols on the walls pulsed brighter, and I could feel them burning their shapes into my retinas. But then I heard Elizabeth's voice again, faint but clear. "Robert, the altar. There's a passage behind the altar." I looked toward the stone slab and saw something I'd missed before, a narrow gap in the wall behind it, barely visible in the shadows. A hidden doorway. The congregation was still chanting, still focused on their ritual. Moving as quietly as I could, I edged toward the altar. The symbols on the walls tracked my movement like eyes, but the hooded figures seemed transfixed by their ceremony. I slipped through the gap and found myself in a narrow stone corridor lit by flickering candles. The walls were covered in more of those disturbing symbols, but these were older, cruder, carved directly into the rock. This part of the church was much older than the main sanctuary, maybe even predating European settlement. The corridor led downward into the earth, carved through solid bedrock. As I descended, the air grew colder, and the sweet, rotten smell became almost overwhelming. I could hear water dripping somewhere in the darkness, and something else. A sound like whispered prayers. The corridor opened into a natural cave chamber, and what I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my life. They were arranged in alcoves carved into the cave walls, dozens of people in various states of preservation. Some looked recently deceased, others were little more than bones and scraps of clothing. But they were all positioned as if praying, kneeling with their hands clasped and their empty eye sockets turned upward. And they were all still moving. Slight movements, barely perceptible, a twitch of finger bones, the subtle rise and fall of chest cavities that should have been still. These weren't just corpses, they were the congregation's eternal service. The missing hikers, transformed into perpetual worshippers, trapped between life and death in endless prayer. In the center of the chamber, in the newest alcove, I found Elizabeth. She was kneeling like the others, but her eyes were still aware, still human. When she saw me, she tried to speak, but no sound came out. Her lips moved soundlessly, and I could read the words, "Help me." I ran to her, tried to pull her to her feet, but she couldn't move. Something had rooted her to the stone floor. Not chains or ropes, but something that seemed to grow directly from the rock itself. Thin, vine-like tendrils had wrapped around her ankles and wrists, connecting her to the cave system. As I knelt beside her, trying to figure out how to free her, I heard footsteps in the corridor behind me. The congregation had realized I was gone. "There's no escape, Ranger Chen." Reverend Blackwood's voice echoed down the passage. "The sacred grove holds all who enter. You cannot leave without completing the service." I looked around frantically for another way out, but there was only the one corridor. We were trapped in a dead-end cave with dozens of the living dead and a cult of transformed predators approaching. That's when Elizabeth managed to whisper something. Just one word. But it changed everything. Fire. I looked where she was pointing with her eyes. In one corner of the chamber, I saw a pile of old wooden crosses, prayer books, and other religious artifacts. Fuel. And in my pack I had emergency flares from my ranger kit. The footsteps were getting closer. I could hear the congregation chanting as they descended into the cave, their voices creating harmonics that made the chamber walls vibrate. I pulled out 2 emergency flares, cracked them both, and threw them into the pile of artifacts. The old wood caught immediately, sending orange light dancing across the cave walls. The symbols carved into the stone began to smoke and hiss where the light touched them. The effect on the congregation was immediate. Their chanting turned to screams of rage and pain. I heard Reverend Blackwood shouting, "Stop him! The sacred symbols! He's destroying the sacred symbols!" But the fire was spreading, and something amazing was happening. As the flames consumed the religious artifacts, the vine-like tendrils holding Elizabeth began to wither and retreat. She gasped, flexing her fingers as feeling returned to her limbs. "The symbols," she croaked. "They're the connection. Burn the symbols." I understood. The carved symbols weren't just decoration. They were part of the binding ritual that kept the victims trapped in eternal service. Without them, the congregation lost their power over the dead. I grabbed more flares from my pack and threw them against the chamber walls. Wherever the fire touched the carved symbols, they cracked and dissolved like they were made of salt. The effect rippled through the cave system, and I could hear screaming from the main church above us. Elizabeth struggled to her feet, supported by my shoulder. Around us, the other figures in the alcoves were beginning to move differently. Not the mechanical prayer motions, but genuine movement. Some were too far gone, nothing but bones and decay. But others, more recent victims, were stirring with returning consciousness. "We have to go," Elizabeth gasped. "The whole place is going to collapse." She was right. The cave was shaking, chunks of ceiling falling as the supernatural architecture lost cohesion. The fire was spreading through the chamber, consuming everything connected to the congregation's ritual. We ran for the corridor, dodging falling rocks and collapsing alcoves. Behind us, I could hear the sounds of the congregation, but they weren't human sounds anymore. Howls, screeches, the sounds of things with too many teeth and not enough sanity. The corridor was partially blocked by debris, but we squeezed through into the main church. The sanctuary was in chaos. The symbols on the walls were burning with cold fire, and the hooded congregation members were writhing on the floor, their robes smoking where the supernatural flames touched them. Reverend Blackwood stood near the altar, no longer looking human. His ancient face was melting, revealing something underneath that had never been human to begin with. When he saw us, he pointed one elongated finger in our direction. "You cannot leave," he shrieked. "The Grove provides. The Grove demands." But his power was broken. The church around us was dissolving, reality reasserting itself. Through the windows, I could see normal forest, pine trees and blue sky instead of the twisted nightmare landscape that had surrounded the building. Elizabeth and I ran for the doors, bursting out into blessed daylight. Behind us, the Church of Sacred Blood was collapsing in on itself, the stones crumbling to dust, the nightmare architecture folding back into whatever dimension it had come from. We ran through the forest until we reached Trail 475, where my GPS started working again and my radio crackled back to life. The rescue teams found us 6 hours later, dehydrated and traumatized but alive. The official report listed Elizabeth Martinez as a missing hiker who became disoriented and lost for several days, found by Ranger Chen during an extended search operation. No mention of impossible churches or supernatural congregations. No one would have believed it anyway. But I know what happened in those woods, and sometimes late at night when I'm patrolling the forest trails, I still hear whispers in the wind. The congregation may be gone, but the woods remember. They always remember. Elizabeth recovered fully and moved back to Charlotte. She sends me a Christmas card every year with a simple message: "Thank you for bringing me home." She never talks about what happened in that cave, and neither do I. As for me, I'm not a rookie anymore. I've been promoted twice and now train new rangers in wilderness rescue techniques, but I always tell them the same thing. If you find something in the forest that shouldn't be there, something that doesn't appear on any map or GPS, don't investigate alone. Call for backup. Trust your instincts. And always carry flares. Because sometimes, the forest provides more than you bargained for. Holy hell, that was intense. Did that ending blow your mind? Like, if you want more terrifying ranger stories, follow for daily supernatural horror. And comment your theory about what really happened to the other missing hikers. I read every single one. What would you have done in Robert's situation? Would you have entered the cursed church? Share your thoughts below. My name is John, and this was the 6th hour searching for Stephanie in the trails of Yellowstone National Park, when my radio crackled with static that shouldn't exist in this frequency range. The October wind cut through my regulation jacket like ice water, carrying the metallic taste of an approaching storm that made my teeth ache. My GPS unit showed coordinates 44.7223 again, 110, 542 Duradner W. 3 miles northeast of the Fairy Falls trailhead, where Stephanie Martinez, 22 years old, had last been seen 18 hours ago. The smell of wet pine needles and something else, something wrong like copper pennies mixed with rotting flowers, filled my nostrils as I called out her name for the 100th time. Stephanie Martinez. Only silence answered, except for the unnatural quiet that had settled over this section of forest. No birds, no squirrels chittering in the branches above. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I checked my Garmin e-Trex again, noting how the screen flickered briefly before stabilizing, something that had been happening more frequently the deeper I pushed into this particular grid section. My boots, standard issue Danner Acadias with 200 miles on them, found purchase on the rain-slicked trail as I followed what might have been human tracks. The tread pattern was wrong, though. Too smooth, too perfect, like someone had deliberately pressed their feet into the mud rather than naturally walking. The hair on my neck stood up as I photographed the prints with my department-issued digital camera, the timestamp reading 2:47 p.m., October 15th, 2018. 18 hours. In wilderness search and rescue, we have a saying: the first 24 hours are everything. After that, you're usually looking for a body. My radio unit, a Motorola APX 6000, sat heavy on my belt, the battery indicator showing 3 bars. I'd been checking in with base every 30 minutes, following protocol, but each report felt more hollow than the last. Unit 23 to base, continuing grid search in Sector 7 Alpha. No sign of subject. Weather deteriorating, visibility dropping. Copy that, Unit 23. Storm front moving in faster than predicted. You've got maybe 2 hours before we need to extract you. 2 hours to find a girl who'd been missing for 18. My jaw clenched as I thought about the phone call from her mother this morning, the woman's voice breaking as she described how Stephanie had gone out for a quick day hike to photograph autumn foliage for her college photography project. Smart girl, according to her family. Responsible. Not the type to go off trail or ignore basic safety protocols. But people did stupid things in the wilderness all the time, and the forest didn't care about your GPA or how responsible your family thought you were. I paused at a bend in the trail, pulling out my water bottle, a dented Nalgene that had seen me through 8 years of ranger service. The water tasted like plastic and my own fear sweat, metallic and bitter. My hands trembled slightly as I capped it, a detail I tried to ignore. Veterans don't get scared. Veterans don't shake. Veterans find missing persons and bring them home safe. The trail forked ahead, neither path marked on my topographic map. This was wrong. I knew every inch of this sector, had hiked it dozens of times. Yet here were 2 clear paths diverging through old-growth pine and Douglas fir, both looking equally traveled, equally real. My compass spun wildly before settling on magnetic north, though something deep in my gut told me not to trust it. Stephanie. My voice echoed strangely in the stillness, seeming to come back changed, distorted. If you can hear me, follow the sound of my voice. That's when I saw her. A woman emerged from the right-hand trail, walking with the measured pace of someone trying not to appear rushed. Early 30s maybe, early. Long dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing hiking clothes that looked expensive but not flashy. Columbia jacket, Patagonia pants, Merrell boots that looked barely broken in. She was beautiful in that effortless way some women managed, even after hours in the wilderness. "Oh, thank God," she called out, her voice carrying perfectly despite the distance between us. "Are you with search and rescue?" I raised my hand in acknowledgement, my training kicking in automatically. "Yes, ma'am. Ranger John Walsh, Yellowstone National Park Service. Are you all right?" She approached with visible relief, though something about her movement seemed off, too fluid, too graceful for someone who'd supposedly been lost in the woods. Her breathing wasn't labored despite the elevation and difficult terrain. Her clothes showed no signs of brush contact or the inevitable wear that came with bushwhacking through dense forest. "I'm Sarah," she said, extending a hand that felt surprisingly warm despite the dropping temperature. "I've been hiking since dawn, and I think I saw something that might help." "About the missing girl?" My pulse quickened. "You saw Stephanie Martinez?" "Maybe. A young woman with long brown hair carrying a camera bag. I saw her yesterday evening around sunset, talking to someone near the old fire tower. She seemed distressed." The old fire tower. That structure had been decommissioned 15 years ago. Its access trail officially closed after budget cuts. It wasn't on any current park maps, and most visitors didn't even know it existed. But I knew it. Every ranger in this district knew about the tower, and we also knew why hikers were discouraged from going there. "Can you show me where?" I asked, already knowing I was about to make a decision that would change everything. Sarah smiled, and for just a moment her teeth seemed too white, too sharp. "Of course, it's not far. just up this trail I found. It's not marked, but it's the most direct route." She gestured toward the right-hand fork, the path that shouldn't exist on any map I'd ever seen. As she moved, I caught that smell again. Copper pennies and rotting flowers, stronger now, emanating from somewhere close. My stomach clenched with sudden nausea, but I forced myself to focus on the mission. Find Stephanie. Bring her home. Everything else was secondary. "Lead the way," I said, checking my radio one more time before following Sarah into the unknown trail. The path wound deeper into old-growth forest, where the canopy grew so thick that afternoon felt like twilight. My watch read 3:15 p.m., but the light filtering through the branches had a strange quality, too green, too dim, like looking at the world through tinted glass. Sarah moved ahead of me with confident steps, never seeming to need to check her footing or push aside the branches that constantly grabbed at my uniform. "How long have you been hiking this area?" I asked, my voice sounding muffled in the unnatural quiet. "Oh, longer than most people," she replied without turning around. "I know these woods very well. Every trail, every shortcut, every hiding place." Something in her tone made my hand drift unconsciously toward my sidearm, a Glock 22 that I'd never drawn in anger during my 8 years of service. The weight of it against my hip was both reassuring and terrifying, because if I was thinking about my weapon, some primitive part of my brain was registering a threat I couldn't yet consciously identify. The trail began to climb steeply, switchbacking up a ridge I didn't remember from any previous hikes in this area. My legs burned with the effort, my breathing becoming labored in the thin mountain air. Sarah, however, showed no signs of exertion. She moved uphill like she was walking on flat ground, never pausing to catch her breath, never stumbling on the loose rocks that constantly shifted under my boots. "Are you from around here?" I asked during a brief rest stop, using the excuse to check my GPS. The screen showed nothing but static, no coordinates, no map data. My radio produced only white noise when I tried to raise base. "You could say that," Sarah answered, and when she turned to look at me, her eyes seemed to reflect light like an animal's. "I've been in these mountains for a very long time, since before the park existed, actually." That should have been impossible. Yellowstone was established in 1872, but the way she said it, with quiet certainty rather than boastfulness, made the hair on my arms stand up beneath my jacket sleeves. "The tower's just ahead," she continued, pointing upslope toward a structure I could barely make out through the trees. "That's where I saw your missing girl." The old fire tower materialized from the mist, like something from a nightmare. 40 feet of rusted steel topped with a glass-walled cabin that had been boarded up for more than a decade, but as we approached I could see that several of the boards had been recently removed, leaving gaps that yawned like empty eye sockets in the growing gloom. More disturbing were the items scattered around the tower's base. A digital camera, expensive, professional grade. A day pack with Stephanie embroidered on the front pocket. A single hiking boot, laces still tied, sitting upright in the pine needles as if its owner had simply stepped out of it and walked away barefoot. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, dropping to one knee beside the boot. It was still damp with morning dew, but something else as well. Something sticky and dark that looked like blood, but smelled like those rotting flowers. "She's up there," Sarah said softly, pointing toward the tower cabin. "At least part of her is." I spun around to face her, my hand now openly resting on my weapon. What the hell does that mean? But Sarah was changing. Her beautiful features remained the same, but there was something else there now. Something ancient and hungry looking out through those reflected eyes. Her skin seemed paler, almost translucent, and I could see dark veins beneath the surface like a roadmap of poison. "It means, Ranger Walsh, that Stephanie served her purpose, just as you're about to serve yours." The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds. My breath came out in visible puffs and ice began forming on the metal rungs of the fire tower ladder. The forest around us fell into complete, unnatural silence. No wind, no insects, no distant bird calls. Even my own heartbeat seemed muffled, as if the air itself had thickened. "What are you?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer would be something my rational mind couldn't accept. Sarah smiled, and this time, her teeth were definitely too sharp, too numerous. I'm very old, John. Old enough to remember when your people first came to these mountains. Old enough to have fed on dozens of young women just like Stephanie. And old enough to know that an experienced ranger like yourself will make a much more satisfying meal than most. If this story is giving you chills, smash that follow button for more supernatural horror. What would you do in John's situation? Comment below. She began walking toward me, each step perfectly silent despite the carpet of dry pine needles. I drew my sidearm, the familiar weight of the Glock steady in my hands, and aimed center mass at her approaching form. Stop right there. Don't move. Sarah laughed, a sound like wind chimes made of bones. Oh, John, bullets won't help you now. Nothing will help you now. I squeezed the trigger. The .40 caliber round struck her center mass and passed through as if she were made of mist, embedding itself in a pine tree 20 feet behind her. She didn't even slow down, didn't acknowledge that I'd fired at all. Instead, she continued her approach, and with each step, she became less human and more something else entirely. Her face elongated, cheekbones pushing out at impossible angles. Her fingers stretched into claws that looked sharp enough to flay skin from bone. But most terrifying of all, her beauty remained, enhanced even by the predatory grace of whatever she truly was. I've been using this form for 3 decades, she said conversationally, as if we were discussing the weather instead of my impending death. Young women like Stephanie are so easy to lure with the promise of help, of sanctuary. But experienced men like you require a different approach. My training kicked in despite the supernatural impossibility of the situation. I keyed my radio, hoping against hope that something would get through. Mayday, Mayday. Unit 23 requesting immediate backup at the old fire tower, Sector 7 Alpha. Suspect is... I couldn't finish the sentence. How do you report that you're being stalked by something that looked human but definitely wasn't? Static answered me. Not even the emergency frequency was working. Stephanie! I shouted toward the tower. Stephanie, if you're up there, I'm here to help. A sound came from the boarded cabin above, weak, barely audible, but definitely human. A moan of pain or fear or both. Sarah's head snapped toward the tower with predatory alertness. She's still alive, if that's what you're wondering. Barely. I've been savoring her, but she won't last much longer without proper attention. Rage flooded through my system, burning away the supernatural fear. This thing, this creature wearing a woman's face, had tortured a 22-year-old girl for almost 24 hours, had probably tortured dozens of others over the decades she claimed to have been hunting these mountains. I holstered my useless sidearm and grabbed the first rung of the tower ladder. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Sarah called out, her voice now containing harmonics that no human throat could produce. The climb is treacherous, but I was already moving, hand over hand up the rusted steel rungs. My gloves provided some protection from the ice that had formed on the metal, but I could feel the cold burning through the material. Each rung felt more unstable than the last, as if the tower itself was trying to shake me loose. 10 feet up, I risked a glance down. Sarah stood directly below me, no longer bothering to maintain her human appearance. What I saw made me nearly lose my grip. Something that might have once been a woman but had been twisted into a predator perfectly designed to hunt human prey. Beautiful and terrible and absolutely alien. Stephanie, I called again as I neared the cabin level. I'm coming. John. The voice was barely a whisper, but it was definitely human, definitely female, definitely terrified. Don't. It's a trap. Of course it was a trap. Everything about this situation had been a trap from the moment Sarah appeared on that impossible trail. But Stephanie was alive, and that meant my job wasn't finished. I reached the cabin platform and tried the door. Locked, but the wood around the handle was rotted enough that a good shoulder check splintered the frame. Inside, the smell hit me like a physical blow. Death and decay and something underneath it all that reminded me of a slaughterhouse. Stephanie was in the corner, tied to a chair with what looked like copper wire that had cut deep grooves into her wrists and ankles. She was alive, conscious, but clearly in shock. Her camera lay in pieces around her feet, and the walls of the cabin were covered with photographs, dozens of them showing young women in various states of terror and despair. "Oh God," she whispered when she saw me. "You have to get out of here. She's not human. She's been feeding on me." I could see what she meant. Stephanie's arms and legs showed dozens of small wounds, too precise to be accidental, too systematic to be random violence. Something had been taking small amounts of her blood over an extended period, keeping her alive and conscious throughout the process. "I'm getting you out of here," I said, pulling out my tactical knife to cut through the wire binding her. But as soon as the blade touched the copper, it felt like grabbing a live electrical wire. Pain shot up my arm and the knife clattered to the floor, too hot to hold. "You can't," Stephanie sobbed. "The wire, it's not normal. Nothing about her is normal." A sound from below made us both freeze. Sarah climbing the tower with inhuman speed, her claws scraping against the metal rungs like fingernails on a chalkboard. She'd reach us in seconds. I grabbed Stephanie's chair and dragged it toward the far side of the cabin, looking for any possible escape route. The boards covering the windows were nailed from the outside, but some had gaps large enough to see through. What I saw in the gathering darkness made my blood turn to ice water. More lights moving through the forest below. Not flashlights. These moved wrong, bobbed wrong, had the blue-white quality of phosphorescence rather than electric illumination, and they were all converging on the fire tower. "She's not alone," I whispered. Stephanie followed my gaze and began hyperventilating. "There are more of them. I saw them the first night. They're all wearing people. Different people, but the same thing underneath." The ladder rungs sang with metallic stress as something much heavier than a normal human ascended toward us. Through the gaps in the floorboards, I could see Sarah climbing with impossible speed, her borrowed human form stretching and distorting as her true nature asserted itself. "Listen to me," I said, gripping Stephanie's shoulders. "I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to do exactly what I say when I say it." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "My phone. It's been texting my family, but it's not me sending the messages. She's been pretending to be me, telling them I'm fine, that I decided to extend my hike. Of course, that's how these disappearances stayed quiet for so long. Family members weren't reporting people missing if they were receiving regular text updates, and by the time the deception was discovered, the victim had been dead for weeks. Sarah's head appeared at the cabin doorway, but it was no longer Sarah's head. The beautiful woman's face had become something from a Renaissance painting of demons, still recognizably human but wrong in every possible way. "Hello, John," she said in a voice like grinding glass. "Ready to join my collection?" I noticed something crucial in that moment. She wasn't entering the cabin. She was crouched in the doorway as if there were some invisible barrier preventing her from coming inside. Old wood, old iron nails, old prayers maybe. Some combination that kept her contained to the threshold. "You can't come in, can you?" I asked. Her smile widened to show far too many teeth. "Clever boy, but you can't stay in there forever, and I'm very, very patient." She was right, of course. We had no food, no water, no way to call for help. But we also had something she didn't expect: time to think. I examined the cabin more carefully, looking for anything that might explain why this creature couldn't enter. The walls were covered with old ranger equipment, decades out of date. Fire weather instruments, radio gear from the 1970s, and there, a small wooden cross nailed above the door, so old and weathered it was barely visible. "Stephanie, are you religious?" She looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "What? Why?" "Just answer me. Do you believe in God and good and evil and things that are holy?" Yes. I mean, I was raised Catholic. Why does that matter?" "Because faith might be the only weapon we had left against something that had been predating on human beings since before the park existed." "I need you to pray," I told her. "I need you to pray harder than you've ever prayed in your life. Pray for protection, for strength, for a way out of here." She nodded and closed her eyes, her lips moving silently, and I could swear I felt something change in the cabin, a warmth that had nothing to do with body heat, a sense of presence that was the exact opposite of the predatory hunger emanating from the doorway. Sarah, or whatever wore Sarah's face, hissed and drew back slightly from the threshold. "Interesting," she said, "but prayer won't save you when dawn comes, and I can enter freely." Dawn. Of course, creatures like this often had rules, limitations that governed their supernatural abilities. She could approach the cabin at night but needed daylight to breach whatever protection the old cross and our faith provided. I checked my watch, 11:30 p.m. We had maybe 6 hours before sunrise, 6 hours to figure out how to kill something that shrugged off bullets and had been hunting these mountains since before my great-grandmother was born. The next few hours passed in a nightmare of psychological warfare. Sarah remained in the doorway, sometimes appearing as the beautiful woman I'd first encountered, sometimes revealing her true form in all its terrible glory. She talked constantly, describing in graphic detail what she'd done to other victims over the decades, how she planned to make our deaths last for days rather than hours. But she also revealed information she probably shouldn't have, details about her nature, her limitations, her connection to this particular place. She'd been bound to the fire tower by some event in the past, trapped in a hunting territory she couldn't leave. The stolen identities, the possessed bodies, even her supernatural abilities were all dependent on maintaining this connection to her original site of power. "What happened here?" I asked during a lull in her monologue. "What made you?" For the first time, uncertainty crossed her features. A mistake, a ritual that went wrong, or perhaps too right. 1952, a group of researchers thought they could control forces they didn't understand. 1952, 6 years before the fire tower was built. Whatever had happened here had predated the structure I was currently trapped in. I helped Stephanie move away from the chair, massaging circulation back into her arms and legs while she continued her silent prayers. Her wounds were worse than I'd initially thought, not just the systematic feeding marks, but signs of psychological torture that would take years of therapy to heal, if they ever fully healed at all. "My family," she whispered. "Do they know I'm really missing?" "They will soon. When I don't check in, search teams will come looking for both of us." But even as I said it, I wondered if that was true. Sarah had demonstrated an ability to manipulate technology, my GPS, my radio, probably my cell phone too. She could easily send fake check-in reports, buy herself more time before anyone realized we were in trouble. Around 3 a.m., the other lights I'd seen in the forest began to approach the tower. Sarah's companions, or perhaps other aspects of the same entity. They circled the base of the structure like wolves, occasionally calling up to her in voices that might have once been human but had been corrupted beyond recognition. "My family," Sarah called down to them in her grinding glass voice. "Soon we'll have fresh meat for everyone." But I was beginning to understand something important about our situation. This creature was powerful, ancient and utterly malevolent, but she was also trapped by the same supernatural rules that governed her existence. She couldn't enter the cabin before dawn, couldn't leave her territory around the fire tower, and most importantly, couldn't affect people who were under some form of spiritual protection. The cross above the door wasn't just decoration, it was a ward, placed here by someone who'd known what kind of evil had been unleashed in 1952. "Stephanie," I said quietly, "I need you to tell me everything you remember about how she captured you. Every detail, no matter how small it seems." Through her tears and trauma, she began to reconstruct the events of 2 nights ago. She'd been photographing sunset from a ridge about 2 miles south when she'd encountered a lost hiker, a beautiful woman who claimed to need help finding her campsite. The woman had led her away from the marked trails deeper into the forest, until they reached what appeared to be a small cabin. But it wasn't really a cabin. It was some kind of construct, an illusion that looked like shelter but was actually a trap. Once Stephanie had entered, she'd found herself in the fire tower instead, bound with copper wire and completely at the mercy of something that fed on human terror as much as human blood. "She made me watch," Stephanie whispered. "Photos and videos on my own camera. other people she'd caught over the years. She wanted me to understand what was going to happen to me. The systematic psychological torture was as important to the creature as the physical feeding. It wasn't just predation. It was a form of worship, a ritual that fed whatever dark force had created her in the first place. But rituals could be disrupted. Worship could be defiled. And traps could sometimes be turned against their creators. I began examining the cabin more systematically, looking for anything else that might have been left by previous rangers or researchers who'd known about this threat. Hidden under decades of dust and debris, I found them: notebooks, field reports, and most importantly, a leather-bound journal dated 1953. The handwriting was barely legible, but the story it told made my blood run cold. A team of university researchers, funded by some unnamed government agency, had come to Yellowstone in 1952 to investigate reports of anomalous phenomena in the backcountry. They'd found evidence of Native American warnings about this area, stories of a hunger spirit that wore human faces and fed on lost travelers. Instead of heeding the warnings, they'd attempted to summon and control the entity for study. The ritual had gone catastrophically wrong, binding the spirit to this location but also giving it unprecedented power within its territory. Of the 6 researchers, only one had survived to write the journal, and his account ended abruptly in mid-sentence, as if he'd been interrupted while writing. But he'd also included detailed notes about the creature's weaknesses. Fire couldn't harm it directly, but burning certain materials could disrupt its connection to the physical world. Salt circles could provide temporary protection, and most importantly, the binding ritual could be reversed if performed correctly. The problem was that the reversal required specific materials, including the ashes of something the creature valued, mixed with earth from the site of its original summoning. I looked around the cabin with new eyes. If this was where the researchers had first contacted the entity, then this was also where it could be banished. But I needed to find remnants of the original ritual site, and I needed to create a fire hot enough to reduce the creature to ash. Dawn was still 2 hours away when I made my decision. Stephanie, I need you to keep praying. No matter what you see or hear in the next few minutes, don't stop praying. What are you going to do? I pulled out my emergency flare gun, standard equipment that I'd forgotten about in the supernatural terror of the evening. 3 flares, each burning at over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot enough to melt copper wire, hot enough to set the entire tower ablaze. I'm going to send this bitch back to hell. Sarah must have sensed my intentions, because she began throwing herself against the invisible barrier at the doorway with increasing desperation. The wooden cross above the door shook with each impact, and I could see hairline cracks forming in its weathered surface. I fired the first flare directly at the copper wire binding Stephanie's chair. The metal melted instantly, releasing her from bonds that had held her for 2 days. She collapsed to the floor, but she was free. The second flare I aimed at the floor of the cabin, where the journal had indicated the original summoning circle had been carved. Ancient symbols became visible in the wood as the intense heat revealed markings that had been hidden for decades. Sarah's screams of rage echoed from the doorway, joined by the howls of her companions below. The entire tower began to shake as if earthquake was ripping through the mountain. But I still had one more flare, and I'd found what I was looking for: a small wooden box hidden under loose floorboards containing what looked like bone ash and dried herbs. The researchers' backup plan, in case their primary ritual failed. I scattered the contents across the burning summoning circle and fired my last flare into the mixture. The explosion of light was visible from space, or so it seemed to my night-adapted eyes. But more than light erupted from that burning circle, something that was the exact opposite of the predatory hunger that had stalked these mountains for 70 years. A cleansing force that made Sarah's screams turn from rage to genuine terror. "No!" she shrieked from the doorway. "You don't understand what you're doing. Without me, there are others, worse things. I was holding them back." But I was beyond listening to the lies of something that had tortured and murdered dozens of innocent people. I grabbed Stephanie and pulled her toward the now blazing hole in the cabin floor. "We're going down through the tower structure," I shouted over the supernatural wind that had begun howling around us. "Stay close and keep praying." The metal ladder was too hot to touch directly, but I used my jacket as protection and began our descent. Above us, Sarah's form was dissolving in the cleansing fire, her stolen beauty finally revealing the ancient corruption underneath. We reached the ground just as the entire tower began to collapse. I shielded Stephanie with my body as burning debris rained down around us. But none of it touched us. The same force that had protected us in the cabin seemed to extend to the clearing around the tower's base. The other lights in the forest, Sarah's family, winked out one by one as their connection to their source of power was severed. Within minutes, the supernatural silence that had blanketed this part of the forest lifted, replaced by normal night sounds and the distant rumble of thunder from the approaching storm. "Is she gone?" Stephanie asked, clinging to my arm as we watched the tower burn. "She's gone," I confirmed, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed it myself. We made our way back to the main trail using my backup flashlight, a journey that took 3 hours through terrain that should have been familiar, but somehow wasn't. The impossible paths Sarah had used to lure us to the tower had vanished, leaving only the official park trails marked on every map. My radio crackled to life as we reached the trailhead, base camp's voice cutting through the static with blessed normalcy. "Unit 23, please respond. You're 3 hours overdue for check-in." "Unit 23 to base," I replied, my voice hoarse from smoke and exhaustion. "Subject located and secured, requesting immediate medical evacuation and a full incident report team." "Copy that, Unit 23. Medical helicopter en route to your coordinates. ETA 15 minutes. As we waited for the helicopter, Stephanie asked the question I'd been dreading. "What are you going to tell them? About what really happened up there?" I looked back toward the dying glow on the horizon, where 70 years of accumulated evil was finally being consumed by cleansing fire. "The truth," I said, "or as much of it as they'll believe. But in my incident report, I would also include a recommendation that the area around the old fire tower be permanently closed to public access, and that any future disappearances in this sector be investigated with extreme caution and a full understanding of what might be waiting in the deep woods." Because even though Sarah was gone, her final words echoed in my memory. "Without me, there are others. Worse things. Some hungers, once awakened, never truly sleep." The helicopter's searchlight cut through the pre-dawn darkness as it approached our position, and I helped Stephanie to her feet. She would need months of physical therapy, years of psychological counseling, and might never fully recover from what she'd endured. But she was alive, and that was what mattered. As for me, I would go home to my wife and daughter, hold them a little tighter, and try not to think about the other fires that might be burning in the deep wilderness. Try not to wonder what other research teams had made, what other mistakes in what other remote locations. Try not to listen too carefully to the radio reports of missing hikers in sectors where the silence seemed just a little too complete. But I would also keep the emergency flares in my pack fully stocked, and I would never again discount the power of an old wooden cross nailed above a door. Some protection is worth believing in, whether you understand it or not. Holy hell, that was intense. Did that ending blow your mind? Like, if you want more terrifying Ranger stories, follow for daily supernatural horror, and comment your theory about what really happened to Stephanie. I read every single one.